Evan Carter's fingers traced the edges of the blueprints like a pianist, caressing the keys of a grand piano. Every line, every calculation, every minuscule detail mattered, not just to the planes he designed, but to the lives that would soar hundreds of feet above the ground because of them. He had spent years building a reputation in the aviation world, and the city knew his name. At 42, he was already considered one of the leading minds in aircraft safety. Other engineers admired him. Younger ones aspired to emulate him. And yet, despite the accolades, Evan never allowed himself the luxury of pride. Precision demanded focus, and focus demanded discipline. His office overlooked the sprawling tarmac of the company's private airfield. The hum of engines in the distance was more than noise. It was a symphony of motion, a living reminder that every bolt, every rivet, every circuit had its purpose. He could look at a plane in flight and see every line of stress, every force acting against it, as if the aircraft itself spoke to him in numbers and equations. Today, he was working on a new safety system, an innovation that could prevent mechanical failures that had plagued the industry for decades. It was elegant, simple, almost too perfect. And that was exactly why it would work. Evan's mind raced ahead, sketching scenarios, testing outcomes in his imagination. He saw what no one else could: the weak points, the stresses that would become disasters if left unaccounted for. He corrected them before they existed. This was the art of his genius. But genius is a light that attracts shadows. Behind the polished glass of his office, colleagues whispered, hiding envy behind polite smiles. The very people who had once nodded in admiration now plotted quietly, measuring their own worth against his brilliance. In the world of innovation, where recognition translated to power and profit, Evan's talent had become a threat. He didn't notice the glances, the murmured doubts. His attention remained on the calculations, on the integrity of steel, on the invisible forces that governed flight. But the world outside his office was already scheming against him. Evan Carter was at the top of his game, untouchable in skill and reputation. But the very qualities that made him extraordinary also made him a target. In the coming months, he would learn that mastery alone could not protect him from envy, betrayal, and the quiet cruelty of those who measured themselves not by what they built, but by what they could destroy. For now, though, he leaned over the table, blueprints spread like a battlefield, and allowed himself a rare, fleeting satisfaction. The plane he envisioned was not just safe, it was perfect. And in this perfection, in this moment of pure creation, Evan felt invincible. But invincibility, as he would soon discover, is an illusion. Evan Carter never saw it coming. The whispers, the cold smiles, the subtle manipulations, they were like tiny cracks forming in the foundation of a building, invisible at first, but deadly in their inevitability. And by the time he noticed, the world he had built with skill and integrity was collapsing around him. It began with a report, innocuous at first glance, questioning the safety of a system he had designed. A few lines of technical ambiguity, a misplaced word in a memo, and suddenly the board was asking questions. Colleagues, once cordial, now leaned forward with feigned concern, their words polite but their eyes sharp, calculating. They asked about minor oversights, about decisions he had made years ago, as if digging for mistakes that weren't there. Evan's initial confidence was unshaken. He answered each question meticulously, presenting data, calculations, simulations. He thought that reason, truth, and experience would be enough to protect him. He was wrong. One by one, Subtle accusations turned into formal complaints. Confidential reports leaked to the press, painting him as careless, arrogant, even reckless. Clients hesitated. The media, hungry for scandal, ran stories with headlines implying negligence. Overnight, the man who had once been the embodiment of brilliance became a symbol of failure. The personal toll was even harsher. Friends stopped returning calls. His colleagues' smiles had long vanished. Now, even casual greetings were replaced with awkward silence or polite avoidance. Evan's family, once supportive, began to distance themselves, swayed by rumors, by the mounting pressure, by the fear of being associated with scandal. Money, too, slipped away like sand through his fingers. Savings accounts, investments, even his modest home, all tied up in the stability of a career that no longer existed, vanished under lawsuits, legal fees, and the sudden collapse of reputation. He walked through the city streets one evening, his briefcase in hand, and realized that he had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, no shield against the storm. And yet, even as the world abandoned him, Evan carried something no one could take away: his mind. Every blueprint, every calculation, every lesson learned over decades of work remained with him. Knowledge, experience, and clarity were his last treasures, unbroken even in the face of total ruin. The city of Lagos was harsh and unforgiving. Streets smelled of smoke and decay. The cries of children, the shouts of street vendors, the indifferent passing of strangers. It was a world far removed from the polished halls of his former life. He found shelter where he could. Abandoned warehouses, empty alleys, the occasional sympathetic stranger who would offer a morsel of food. Even in despair, Evan observed, he studied the city's machinery, the way engines rattled, the way wires were connected, the patterns in the chaos around him. Every detail, every interaction became part of a new mental map, a new kind of design. It was not the structured perfection of his office, but it was alive, complex, and full of lessons. And in this chaos, he discovered a strange clarity. While others saw only survival, Evan saw patterns. While the world had turned against him, he realized that his mind, the one thing no one could corrupt, was more powerful than ever. He didn't yet know how, but he would rise again. Because even in the shadows, a mind like Evan Carter's does not stay buried forever. The nights in Lagos were unforgiving. The air carried the acrid scent of smoke and exhaust, mingled with the faint, lingering aroma of street food. Rain had a way of turning the alleys into rivers of mud, but Evan learned to move through them silently, as if the city itself had become a machine, and he was one of its gears, turning unseen yet essential. He no longer had a home. He no longer had money. He no longer had allies. What remained was his mind, sharp, unbroken, a precision instrument honed by decades of engineering. And slowly, deliberately, he began to see his new reality not as a prison but as a laboratory. Evan observed everything: the mechanics of the city, the flow of people, the way vehicles moved like controlled chaos, the improvisations of street vendors who built ingenious tools from scraps of metal and wire. Every detail was a lesson. Every failure, every improvised fix, every unnoticed pattern became a mental blueprint. He watched the world like a silent engineer studying a massive, unpredictable machine. He noted how the weak points in systems, both mechanical and human, revealed themselves under stress, how power shifted, how greed and fear influenced behavior. In this way, even the filthiest, most dangerous corners of Lagos became a classroom. Food was a problem, of course. Shelter was another. But Evan approached survival as he would any engineering challenge. Analyze, adapt, optimize. He discovered hidden nooks behind abandoned buildings where he could stay dry during the rains. He learned which street vendors offered the best meals for the least money, or sometimes no money at all. He identified patterns in the movements of the local gangs and avoided conflict, always keeping himself invisible. And yet, even as he adapted, Evan refused to become hardened or bitter. Every night, he sketched mental diagrams of engines, circuits, and flight patterns. He recreated the complex systems he had once designed, piece by piece, in his memory. His brilliance had no roof, no walls, no restrictions. Even if the city threatened to crush him, it could not touch what lived in his mind. He began experimenting with small projects. A discarded generator powered a makeshift light. Rusted pipes became a water filtration system. He scavenged broken electronics and rebuilt them, teaching himself lessons in improvisation and resilience that no office job could have offered. It was in this period of forced exile that Evan began to understand something profound. Observation was more than survival. Observation was power. By studying both the machines and the people around him, he could anticipate failures before they happened. He could see the hidden weaknesses in systems that everyone else assumed were stable. And slowly, imperceptibly, a plan began to form in his mind. Not just a plan for survival, but for return. The city, once alien and hostile, was now a network of knowledge, and he was learning its hidden architecture. Even in darkness, even in despair, Evan Carter had begun to regain control, not of the world outside, but of the one thing that mattered most: himself. For a man who had once commanded the skies, the streets of Lagos were just another challenge, and challenges, Evan knew, were meant to be solved. Evan had grown accustomed to the rhythm of Lagos, the harsh days, the restless nights, the constant calculus of survival. Yet no amount of adaptation could prepare him for the urgent knock that would shatter his fragile equilibrium. It arrived as an unexpected message, a summons from Noah Blake, the billionaire owner of the very aviation company that had once been Evan's world. The call was brief, desperate, almost frantic. "We need you," Blake said, his voice a mixture of fear and urgency. "If you don't help us, more lives will be lost." For a moment, Evan hesitated. He had spent months in exile, rebuilding himself from the ground up, and the wounds of betrayal still ached. But the problem before him was not about pride or revenge. It was about lives, hundreds, maybe thousands. And the precision of his mind, sharpened even further by survival, could make the difference between catastrophe and salvation. He traveled back to the city that had once celebrated him, now entering its towers with quiet resolve. The sleek glass walls, the polished floors, the artificial hum of controlled air, all of it felt foreign, almost alien, after months in the streets. Yet Evan moved with the confidence of a man who had learned to read the chaos of the world. Inside the emergency control room, tension crackled like static electricity. Charts, diagrams, and reports were scattered across tables. Engineers argued over data, technicians pored over flight logs, and managers moved nervously between phones and emails. Everyone seemed to see panic instead of possibility. Evan surveyed the room calmly, letting his mind process patterns invisible to everyone else. He could see where assumptions had gone wrong, where hidden errors were waiting to erupt. Every flight report, every maintenance log, every safety test was stored in his mind, analyzed instantly against decades of experience. Hours passed in a blur of calculations, cross-references, and mental simulations. Blake hovered anxiously, pacing the floor, while journalists outside demanded answers. But Evan worked silently, relentlessly, as if time itself bent to his concentration. Finally, he found it. A subtle, nearly invisible flaw in the structural design of a component. It was buried deep within complex systems, overlooked by teams that had relied too heavily on software and automated checks. A single corrective measure, properly implemented, would prevent the failures that had claimed lives. Evan drew up the adjustments with meticulous care, explaining each step to the remaining engineers. They listened, initially in disbelief, then with mounting respect as the implications became clear. The changes were implemented, tested, and approved. The aircraft resumed operations, now safer than ever, with disaster averted. In that moment, as the last report confirmed the success of his corrections, Evan felt a quiet satisfaction, not the shallow triumph of recognition, but the profound certainty of purpose fulfilled. Lives had been saved because he refused to let despair, betrayal, or circumstance define him. Noah Blake approached him, awe and relief mingling in his expression. "You've done the impossible," Blake said, voice low, reverent. "I don't know how to thank you." Evan only shook his head. "No thanks needed," he said. "Just make sure it never happens again." For the first time since his fall, Evan felt the world bending back into order. Not perfectly, but enough to remind him that mastery was not something taken away. It had merely been waiting for him to reclaim it. The days that followed were a quiet revelation for Evan Carter. The city he had once known as a place of betrayal and ambition now felt different. Not because Lagos had changed, but because he had. The chaos of the streets, the struggle to survive, and the meticulous work of saving lives had transformed him into something more than the engineer who had once sat atop glass towers. Noah Blake kept his promise. Evan was offered the position of chief engineer, a role that recognized not only his technical brilliance, but also his resilience, his discipline, and the clarity of thought that had seen him through months of isolation. It was more than a job. It was a chance to rebuild, not just his career, but the integrity of the systems he had dedicated his life to perfecting. Evan accepted, but he did so on his own terms. He implemented stricter safety protocols, improved oversight, and brought the lessons of survival into the corporate world. He trained engineers not only to design, but to anticipate failure, to observe the hidden patterns in both machines and people. His experience on the streets had taught him that true mastery required understanding the world in its rawest, most unpredictable form. Recognition returned, but this time it was tempered by something deeper than fame. Colleagues who had once betrayed him now approached with genuine respect. Students and young engineers sought him out, inspired by both his genius and his resilience. And though wealth and status returned, Evan found himself valuing the lessons of humility, patience, and observation more than any title or paycheck. Even more profoundly, Evan had learned to forgive, not for others, but for himself. He no longer measured himself against the betrayals he endured. The scars remained, but they were no longer chains. They were reminders of endurance, markers of the journey that had shaped him into a man who could thrive even when the world turned against him. He returned to the skies, not merely as an engineer, but as a guardian of life and innovation. Every flight, every plane that left his oversight, carried the imprint of his dedication. Lives were protected, disasters prevented, and safety standards elevated across the industry. And in the quiet moments, alone in his office, reviewing blueprints or standing at the edge of the tarmac, Evan would allow himself a small, private satisfaction. He had fallen farther than most could imagine, survived what many could not endure. And now, standing at the pinnacle once more, he knew the truth. Talent and integrity cannot be destroyed, no matter how deep the betrayal or how long the fall. Evan Carter had reclaimed his life, his career, and his honor. But more importantly, he had mastered himself. The streets of Lagos, the betrayal of colleagues, the isolation and hunger, they had all been part of the crucible that forged not just a brilliant engineer, but a man who could withstand the worst and still rise higher than ever. The world had tested him, and he had triumphed.